Hello and welcome. Today I want to introduce you to a big problem, one that is being ignored to a worrying extent. This is something that you encounter on day-to-day basis but never take any notice of, and that is the problem of standard form contracts. If you are a working age adult, you probably encounter hundreds of these contracts every single month. Think about it. When you buy something online, there's the contract to use a device, another with the internet service provider, then one contract with your software company, one with the website itself. Then, when you actually make a purchase, you enter into a contract with your bank, your card service provider, and sometimes even more parties if you use something like buy now pay later service. All this for just one simple transaction. In other words, every tiny action can bind you to the terms and conditions of several different companies. And all this happens through a very specific kind of agreement, the standard form contract. These are pre-drafted contracts written entirely by the provider of the goods or services. You, the customer, don't negotiate, you just accept the terms as conditions of using the product or service. Unlike traditional contracts where both sides sit down to negotiate, standard form contracts are one-sided. One party sets the rules, the other simply agrees. In academic terms, this is called an imbalance of bargaining power. But here's the twist. This wasn't always a bad thing. Standard form contracts actually exist because they make things more efficient. Imagine a train company selling tickets. They can't realistically negotiate a separate contract with every single passenger. So they use the same terms for everyone. So, what's the problem? The problem begins when the contracts are used to exploit the party with less bargaining power, usually the consumer. You give up your ability to negotiate for the sake of convenience. But what happens if a term is just plain unfair? Let me give you an example. Imagine our train company again. Suppose there is a condition saying you can't get a refund, even if the train is cancelled. You'd probably agree that's unfair. And thankfully, the law steps in to protect you. Consumer protection laws usually require a refund in cases like this. But what about less obvious unfair terms? Sometimes a condition is hidden deep in the fine print, written in dense legal language. Maybe there is a clause that removes all legal responsibility if the company leaks your personal data. Or think about a holiday booking that charges you 100% as a cancellation fee, or a forced arbitration clause in your employment contract. If you are desperate for a job, you would sign it, even though it would mean you can't directly go to court if something goes wrong. Or a tenancy agreement that stops you ending your lease even if you discover mold or hidden problems after moving in. Now, you might be thinking, don't laws protect us in these situations? Isn't there such a thing as renters' rights, employee rights, or basic consumer protection? And yes, there are protections in place. But here's the catch. Unfair terms have become more subtle, harder to spot, and even harder to tackle with existing laws. They might not be as blatant as no refunds ever, but they can be hidden in complicated, hard to read sections and are often just as unfair. As I said, the law does give consumers some tools. For example, in the UK, Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977 allows you to challenge an unfair terms in contract, even if you agree to the larger contract. There are other laws too, like the Consumer Protection Act. But here's something crucial, and remember this. You don't encounter fewer unfair terms today, you just notice fewer of them. And that's a big difference. What's really happening is a hidden crisis. Our exposure to unfair and exploitative terms have actually increased because of technology. Think about it. Services are more complex, more parties are involved, and every transaction seems to involve a mountain of terms and conditions. We are bombarded with fine print, and honestly, who has the time, energy, or legal expertise to read it all. So, instead of challenging unfair terms, we just ignore them. Or at best, switch to another provider. But what happens when there aren't any real alternatives? Especially in markets where technology creates temporary monopolies or near monopolies. And in such situation, let's look at those two ways to tackle unfair terms that we talked about earlier. First, challenging them in court. But as we have seen, these terms are buried in long, incomprehensible contracts. Very few people actually read them, fewer still challenge them. Now with technology and the sheer volume of information, it has become nearly impossible. This is the cognitive overload problem. We simply can't keep up. Second, the financial cost. Big companies have the resources to fight these challenges. And as services become more complex, even courts struggle to keep up. It takes time and money to prove that a term is unfair. For sake of better understanding, let me give you a real-life example from the UK. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some broadband service providers in the UK raised their monthly charges mid-contract by huge amounts. Why? Because there were clauses in their contracts allowing for inflation-linked price rises. So for instance, your contract might say, we can increase your fee by 3.9% plus the rate of inflation. After COVID hit, inflation skyrocketed, and in some cases, customers saw their broadband bills jump by up to 17%. You might ask, why not just cancel? Well, almost every provider had the same clause, and if you tried to leave, you'd be hit with cancellation fee, often over £200, and sometimes even more than £500. And let's be honest, in today's world, internet access is essential for work, study, and even job hunting. So what happened? Broadband companies passed on their cost to customers, many of whom were already struggling during the pandemic. This is a classic example of how standard form contracts enabled by technology can be used to exploit customers. Of course, regulators do step in sometimes. For example, Ofcom, the UK's communication regulator, eventually banned this inflation-linked price rises and forced companies to be more transparent. But often, regulation is too slow. By the time authorities notice the problem, many people have already been harmed. Take the cryptocurrency boom. Young, often vulnerable investors were targeted and charged outrageous fees because crypto market was so unregulated. Buy now, pay later services are another example where regulations are just only catching up. Even delivery apps often bury exploitative terms for their workers in the fine print. And it's not just small companies. Even giants like Apple have been accused of unfair terms, like automatically opting users into their cloud services, making it harder to switch providers. If you look, you'll find countless other examples by big names and unknowns alike, depicting opportunistic behavior and using standard form contracts as tools to exploit customers. Well, now that we understand the problem, what's the solution? My suggestion is that the regulators need to be more paternalistic in a protective way. We can keep the efficiency of standard form contracts, but introduce a risk assessment process for every contract used by mass market services. How? Either the relevant regulator or a central legal body could approve new standard contracts before they are offered to the public. They would assess the risks and identify any potential unfair terms before they reach the consumers. This isn't as radical as it sounds. It already happens. For example, in finance, public companies must get their prospectus approved before raising funds from the public. Similarly, in pharmaceuticals, every new drug requires approval by the regulator. So why not do the same for contracts that affect millions? Of course, some people will say this goes against the idea of freedom of contract or the free market, and that the markets should correct themselves. But in reality, today's markets are shaped by temporary monopolies and contracts that don't reflect genuine consent. Waiting for markets to self-correct just means leaving people vulnerable, letting the most exploited suffer in the meantime. Therefore, we need to solve the problem of exploitation created by standard form contract due to rise of technology. Let me know what you think in the comments. Have you ever encountered unfair terms? Do you agree that there is a problem? And do you agree with my solutions?